If you're just joining us, we're going verse by verse through the book of James. And as we come to verse 13, James makes a turn. Up to this point, he's been speaking about trials, the pressures that test faith, shape endurance, bring us into maturity. Verse 12 closes with a promise. Blessed is the one who endures under trial, for when they have stood the test, they will receive the crown of life that the Lord promises to those who love him. If the promise in verse 12 reveals the goal, verse 13 now exposes the obstacles. That promise, life for those who love him, becomes the backdrop for everything that follows in these verses. James will soon reveal the other side of that promise. The path that leads not to life, but to death. An echo of Genesis in verses 13 through 16, the same ancient pattern of desire, distortion, and death that unfolded in Eden. Between those two ends lies a single dividing line, how the heart responds to pressure. So James shifts the lens. He moves from what happens to us to what is revealed within us. Trials don't invent the divided heart, they expose it. The same pressure that refines one person uncovers fractures in another. What the crown of life confirms in the faithful, the same trial may reveal a drift in the divided. In the Greek, the same word is used for both, parazo. James's word choice shows that the difference isn't in the event, but in how it's received. The same pressure becomes either refining or distorting, depending entirely on the heart that meets it. James writes, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God." This is a helpful statement for everyone. But if we stay inside James's flow, we see he is not correcting the sincere struggler. He is confronting the divided heart, the person shielding their desires from exposure by shifting responsibility upward toward God. The reason goes something like this. If God brings good out of trials, then perhaps this temptation is part of his plan. Maybe the pull I feel begins with him. It sounds theological, but it avoids the truth. It projects our fractured inner world onto God and quietly excuses divided loyalty by attributing its pull to his hand. The soul cornered by desire begins to rewrite its theology to avoid exposure. And every time we do that, we reenact the exile, turning from the one who heals toward the illusion that someone else, even God, is to blame. Back in verse 12, James has showed us that the way has been opened up to the life that humanity lost, the life of God. Here he exposes the very pattern that once drove us out. Desire misread, God misinterpreted, and trust fractured. James refuses to let this distortion stand. He's not shaming the struggler, he's trying to restore sight. The one who endures becomes whole. The one who blames remains divided. And if the crown of life is restored humanity, life healed and made whole, then temptation offers the counterfeit, the slow unmaking of the self through disordered love. When we stop externalizing and start naming what arises within, we return to truth, to the God who tempts no one, and who alone can restore what has been torn in two. This is why James later calls believers to confess their sins to one another, that they may be healed. What is fractured through blame is restored through honesty. Here James recognizes the old reflex of Genesis reappearing in us. The ancient movement that began in Eden, when humanity misread God's nature as withholding and blamed him for what arose within. This is a deeply human reflex, ancient, psychological, instinctive even. Eve perceived God as withholding wisdom, something James already has said God gives generously. Adam, when confronted, shifts blame onto God. It was the woman that you gave me. In both moments, God's character was reinterpreted through a disordered heart. James is guarding the church from the subtle return of that distortion, reshaping God's nature to justify our misalignment. For the God he proclaims as the generous giver in 1:5 cannot, by his nature, be the source of temptation or the author of divided loyalty. James's audience would have felt this reflex to blame in their bones, because the story of Israel in the wilderness was their story too. When the water ran out, the people cried, "Is the Lord among us or not?" When the manna grew monotonous, they grumbled that God had led them into the desert to die. The pressure did not create disloyalty. It revealed where their trust was thin. Hardship becomes a mirror, exposing not what God was doing to them, but where their hearts had withdrawn the weight of their trust from resting on Him. And James knows the same pattern can reappear in the scattered church. When pressure arises, the human heart is tempted to interpret pain as abandonment and difficulty as evidence of God's displeasure. So James is calling them and us to remember God's character rightly in the wilderness. So James anchors us again in God's singular, undivided nature. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and He Himself tempts no one. Although James is addressing the divided person, these words steady every believer as he prepares to speak about desire that comes from within. He knows how the human heart drifts. If the trial is painful and desire stirs within it, we begin to suspect God, to imagine He withheld something needed or arranged circumstances against us. But that suspicion is simply the Eden reflex returning. So James says plainly, God cannot be tempted by evil. You see, there's no lack in Him, no shadow, no inner division for evil to appeal to. Temptation depends on deficit, an imagined good that could be supplied, and God is deficit in nothing. God has no unmet need. He is complete in Himself, what theologians call aseity, self-existent fullness. There's nothing for evil to cling to in God. He is light without shadow, goodness without mixture. He is the refiner, not the arsonist. Think of it this way. You can't walk into Cold Stone Creamery and order a Chick-fil-A spicy chicken sandwich with waffle fries and a side of Chick-fil-A sauce. Not because they're withholding it from you. They don't have the ingredients. In the same way, evil has nothing to draw from in God. There's no darkness on His shelf. To imagine God tempting is to imagine Him serving what has never existed in His nature. And before James ever speaks of desire's drift, we need to remember this. Temptation itself is not disloyalty. It is the crossroads where loyalty can be reaffirmed. Temptation exposes where love may drift, but it does not define the heart unless desire is conceived. And this is precisely why James now lifts our eyes back to God's wholeness, because He is whole. His people are called to wholeness, not moral perfectionism, but restoration of design. In Christ, the undivided life of God has entered creation, so creation might share in His integrity, to love without duplicity, to trust without suspicion, to live without a split allegiance. Temptation doesn't negate that allegiance. Resisting it displays it. Temptation is not failure, it is formation. It is the moment where the heart learns again to say, "My loyalty is to God alone." But when the soul forgets who He is, it projects instability onto Him. And we begin to imagine God as we feel, sometimes generous, sometimes withholding, faithful in word, but maybe fickle in practice. The broken mirror reflects its cracks back at the light. James is correcting that. A.W. Tozer said, "What comes into our mind when we think about God is the most important thing about us." James might agree with this. This is why James follows with a warning. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Because deception begins when we misread God and ends when we misread our own desires. Because what we believe about God shapes how we interpret every trial, every delay, and every silence. So before describing how temptation unfolds, James anchors the reader in God's goodness. Do not build your theology in the middle of your pain. Remember who God has always been. The same fire that tests can become the furnace of accusation if you forget the one who stands with you, redeeming it with his purpose. This is why James must correct the reflex. A distorted view of God always leads to a distorted response to pressure. When we project our dividedness onto God, we begin to recreate God in the likeness of our fractured self. It's the quiet beginning of idolatry. So before speaking of desire in verse 14, James restores the image of the giver. God is generous, not withholding. God is single in nature, not divided. God is wholly good, with no evil in him. God forms, he does not deform. God refines, he does not entice. But if God does not tempt us, then what of the tests that come? James has already said to count it all joy. So we ask, if God isn't tempting, is he testing me? It's a fair question that needs reframing. James is not describing a God who arranges hardship, but a God who meets us in it. The trial is real, but its source is life in a fractured world. This is why James reaches for the image of a refiner. A refiner heats the metal until impurities arise, but the heat does not create the flaw, it reveals it. The heat rises from pressures without, desires within, the forces opposed to God, but the nearness belongs to him. The refiner doesn't step back, he leans in. He stays near, attending the heat, watching the impurities rise, waiting until his reflection returns. We live in a fallen world, marked by grief, corruption, disorder. God does not manufacture the furnace, he meets us in it. The broken world generates its own heat. God's role is not ignition, but nearness. He is the midwife who stays through the pain. He is the companion who turns what could deform into what forms. He does not create darkness, he transforms it. He does not set the trap, he untangles the soul. And even here, James is careful. Temptation is not the unmaking of the soul. It is the moment where the old loves can be exposed and true love can be strengthened. The unmaking happens only when desire conceives, in verse 15. Temptation is the arena, not the verdict. The God who gives us birth through his word, in 1:18, does not plant snares for his children. Temptation belongs to the old creation's collapse, not the new creation's life. Imagine a climbing guide. He did not create the mountain or the storms, but he knows the way. He anchors the rope. He remains connected. When the climber slips, he holds. When the climber panics, he steadies. The danger does not come from the guide, but the safety does. The distinction lies at the heart of James 1:13. Trials do not give God new information. They give us new formation. They reveal where our faith rests. They expose our need. They teach us where we have relied on ourselves. They show us the strength of the one we are tethered to. James cares about formation, the shaping of a life reflecting God's wholeness. The athlete endures training to gain strength. The student persists through study to gain wisdom. The parent stays awake through long nights because of love. We accept hardship when we trust the outcome, when we believe the process has purpose. James wants his readers to know the same is true of the Christian life. God does not tempt you. He does not orchestrate your pain, but he is present in it, forming you, refining you, rooting you in love, and shaping you to bear the weight of his glory. And that prepares us for the next movement, not the fire around us, but the desire within us. Underneath everything James has said runs a single thread, wisdom's vision of wholeness. James writes as one of the lines of Proverbs of the Syriac, where wisdom is not information but integration, a rightly ordered life flowing from a rightly ordered heart. For James, integrity begins with how we see God. If God is single, unmixed, undivided in purpose, then to align with him is to become the same, wholehearted, teleos, complete. But when our vision of God fractures, our lives fracture with it. A double-minded vision of God breeds double-minded faith, unstable, tossed by circumstances. The exile was never geographic. It became inward. The fracture that once drove humanity from the garden still echoes in the human heart unless we allow the refining of trials to reform us and form us into the image of the one who is undivided. This is why James treats temptation as a wisdom issue. Temptation divides because it splits love between two masters. It offers a counterfeit coherence, life ordered around self rather than God. But wisdom calls us back to the simplicity of devotion, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The whole letter is a wisdom sermon on integrity. From count it all joy to purify your hearts, you double-minded, James guides the scattered church back to wholeness, the undivided life reflecting God's undivided goodness. The path of wisdom is not escape from trial, but participation in God's steadfastness within it. As we see him more clearly, we become like him, steadfast, sincere, whole. The divided soul becomes a single heart, and the fractured world glimpses its creator through his people. In that light, temptation becomes a place where wisdom is practiced, where love is recentered and fidelity is quietly strengthened. The moment of temptation is not the collapse of wholeness, but the place where wholeness can be chosen and formed in us. The God who tests no one with evil is the same God who gives us birth through his word of truth, forming a people who reflect his consistency and steadfastness in a restless world.